So let's work on our auth reducer. And for the moment, as I mentioned, we'll ignore any HTTP requests we send. So for example, this will stay here. But instead, my goal is to dispatch actions once we're done with the HTTP request. So once we got a response. So for example, here, where I tap in and I call this handle authentication. In handle authentication, we effectively create a new user object, and previously we used our subject to then emit this to our application. This is exactly what I need to store in my NGRX store now, and that is therefore where I want to step in and dispatch a new action. So here in handle authentication. The same, for example, in logout. There where we cleared our user. So basically whenever I called user next, in all these places, I want to step in and use NGRX and dispatch an action. For that, we need actions. So let's go back here and add a authActions.ts file. And in that authActions.ts file, let's create a couple of constants again, a couple of identifiers for these different actions. And which actions do we have here? Well, we have login, for example. So when a user did log in. And we also, of course, have logout when a user did log out and therefore should be removed. So when that user object should be cleared. Now, as you learned, actions are not just about their identifiers. Instead, an action is an object based on a class. So export a class here named login. And there, just as before, we'll implement action, which is imported. So let's import action from @ngrx store. That's important. Now this action interface, which we implement, forces us to add a read-only type. And that type here will be, well, login. That's the identifier for the login action. Now when logging in, we want to create and store a new user. And if we have a look at the auth service at handle authentication, we see that a user is in the end created here with email, user ID, token, and expiration date. Now we have two routes we can take. We can either create the user before we dispatch and then just attach the finished user object to the action as a payload, or we attach these four pieces of information as a payload and create the user in the reducer. Now ultimately that is up to you, but I'm a fan of moving more of that logic into the reducer, and therefore in my action here I'll add a constructor. Well, we would have needed that anyways, but here my payload will actually be a type or auth type object where we get these four pieces that make up a user: email, user ID, token, and expiration date. So an email, which is a string, a user ID, which is a string, a token, which is a string, and an expiration date, which is a date object. This is how a payload for the login action will look for me. But as I mentioned, you could also argue that a payload is just a user object and then you create that user object before you dispatch. Anyways, that's the login class I want to go with. Now we also need a logout class that implements action, and that's our logout action. This also has a read-only type, which is in this case logout. And does it need any payload, any data that is attached to it? No, it doesn't. It doesn't need any payload because if we log out, we just want to clear a user, but we need no extra data for that. We will just set user equal to null. Therefore, this looks like a good authActions file to me. Almost, at least. I, of course, want to export my union type, my authActions union type, just as we had in the shopping list actions file as well. There we had the shopping list actions where we united all these actions into one type. I want to do the same here, and therefore login or logout can all be used with that authActions summary or union type here. Back to the auth reducer. In the auth reducer, I now of course want to use my actions. And first of all, we can be clear about the type action will be here. It will be of type authActions. AuthActions is here imported from authActions, and we could definitely import it like this, but I will fall back to that star as authActions import syntax. Now authActions is an object with all the things exported by the authActions file, and therefore if I want to have the authActions type, we have to access it with auth actions. Now this double name might be confusing, but again, the first part here is just this container name of all the things that are exported by the file, and then with a dot we access the different exported things, like our string identifiers or this auth actions union type. Now inside of the reducer, we can again switch on the action type and handle the different cases. And the first case on my auth actions will be login. The second case will be log out. Whoops, not the class though, but the identifier with the uppercase characters. And we will also have a default case where we just return the state. This is extremely important for correctly initializing our overall store. Now let's start with the login auth action. What's the idea here? What do we have to do? Well, if we have a look at the auth service, we in the end call handle authentication, where we in the end have to simply create such a user object with the data we're getting. That's all we have to do for now. So in the auth reducer, I will create a new user here by calling new user using the user model, which you therefore need to import into this file. We're already doing that here. And now to that user, we need to pass some data. And that's all data we're getting from our payload. So user here takes an email, for example. Well, we get that from our action payload, which has an email property. For the ID, it's the same. We have a payload, which has a user ID property. For the token, it's again the same. We have a payload with our token property. And for the date, again, we have a payload with the expiration date property. So this creates a new user object, and now of course we don't need to emit this with a subject, we simply have to return this as part of our state for this part of the application store. So here we return a new object, and just as before, always copy the old state, and then overwrite what you want to overwrite, and here I want to overwrite the user property and store my new user. So I said user equal to user, where the first user refers to my user property in that state slice, and the second user after the colon refers to this constant. Now the green wiggly lines here simply mean that I could shorten this to just this syntax, which is a TypeScript simplification that allows me to, well, if the variable name of the value and the property name are the same, we can shorten this, but to make it really clear what's happening, I'm deliberately using the longer syntax. Now for logging out, it's very simple. There I also want to copy the old state, and then I will set user to null here. It's as simple as that. Just want to clear it. Well, with that, the reducer is prepared. The actions are prepared. What's missing? We're never dispatching actions. And of course, we're also not using our store in any part of the application. Instead, we're still always using our subject here, our user subject from the shopping list service. Let's tackle that next. Let's start with dispatching. And for that, of course, for the moment, I want to dispatch from inside my auth service. Now, previously, with the shopping list, we mainly dispatched from inside components, though the recipe service and the add multiple ingredients case was an exception. In general, you can dispatch from wherever you want and need to. Now, that being said, we will restructure that service later to also handle these async HTTP requests with NGRX, but for the moment, since we do it in that service, I will dispatch from inside that service once we're done with the HTTP request. And therefore, let's inject our store here. I'll store it in a store property, and the type is, of course, store, where store is imported from NGRX store here. And with that store imported, this is a generic type, as you learned, and again, I want to get the type definition of my application store. So I will import everything as from app by pointing at from store app reducer, and then here we can use from app state. Now that's the store injected. Now with the store injected here, let's go to all the places where we call this user next, because that is where we currently update our state, because we emit a new value to the world. And that would be here in auto login, for example. So instead of using this user next, here I want to use this store dispatch, and I want to log in here, right? Because that's effectively what happened here. We have a loaded user with a token. Well, that simply means that we want to log that user in now. We want to treat that user as logged in. And therefore, we need access to our actions. Hence, let's scroll up and import everything as of actions from store of actions here. And now back to that part where we just worked on. Let's dispatch a new action here. A new object has to be created because an action is an object. And let's refer to of actions and then use the login class here. Now this requires a bunch of data. It requires an object with a couple of keys. With the email key, for example, we get that from the loaded user. So here we access the email. We also need to set the user ID, which we also get from the loaded user. There we have an ID. And the same for the token. We set this equal to loaded user token. Now for the date, it's a bit more tricky. We can get that from our user data though, with this code. So I can just copy that code. Of course, we could have also stored it in a separate constant to avoid copying it. And then simply set expiration date equal to new date of user data token expiration date. Now we dispatch, or we create an object which we then dispatch here in our auto login for logging a user in. Before we test this, let's handle all the other parts as well. For example, for logging out, we want to use the store and dispatch a new action, so a new auth action. And here it's the logout action, which does not require any additional data. So here we don't need to pass anything. And last but not least, if we scroll down to handle authentication, here where I call user next, just as before, I'll comment this out and instead call this store dispatch new auth actions log in. And again, we need to pass in data here. We need to pass in the email of the user. And here I already created a user object. This is of course redundant, so let's remove that. And let's instead forward the data we're getting as arguments here. So let's forward email. For the user ID, let's use user ID. For the token, let's use, well, the token argument we're getting. So I'm just passing on these arguments. And we're deriving the expiration date here. So let's forward this as well, like that. Now we're dispatching our new login action with all the data we're getting here inside of handle authentication. Now last but not least, here I'm storing a user object in local storage, and therefore it's not that good that I removed it. Until we handle that differently, I'll therefore will bring back my user creation, deleted it too early. Again, this is just temporary though. We will find a better solution for this later, but for now we need the user object here because we do access local storage, and that is something you should not do from inside your reducer. It's not asynchronous code, but it's a so-called side effect still. So it is something that is not directly connected to your state. It's something you do besides updating your app state, and therefore this should not go into a reducer. It wouldn't break the reducer, but it would be considered a bad practice. And I will show you how to handle such side effects with NGRX later. So for the moment, let's have this extra bit of redundancy here where we create a user, even though we then create it again in a login action or in the auth reducer to be precise. We will tackle this later. With all of that, we do dispatch all these actions, but now of course, we also need to make sure that we use our auth state. That's the next thing we'll take care of.